this lesson, we're going to go over how to work the plaid stitch when you are turning. This is similar to the plaid stitch that we worked in the first module, but this time I'm going to give a little more instruction and a little more guidance. So we're going to start with the foundation, the same foundation that we started in module 1. I worked a chain 25, and then starting in the first chain from the hook, I worked a row of single crochet across the chain. For this piece, I'm using dark charcoal gray for my dark, a mid lighter gray for my mid color, and then white for my light. So I'm starting with my dark. And the first row is similar to everything we've been working. You're going to chain 1. And I'm going to be working the 1x3 plaid stitch. So I'm working 3 double crochet stitches, and that will make up the entire block for the one color. So there's my 3 stitches, and I'm going to join my mid color. And I'm going to alternate between my dark and my mid all the way across. Take care that you are carrying the end as you go. And remember to keep your yarns from tangling. You want to keep one yarn to the front, one yarn to the back. So we've made it to the end. We've alternated between our dark and our mid. And so we're ready to join our light color. And you're going to join by simply pulling a loop through. Pull it through as if you're working a chain, and then pull the gray until the loop disappears. And then you're ready with your first loop. Now this is where the turning plaid and the joined plaid differ. I am working a single row plaid, meaning that the block is made up by the single row. And so when I begin to work this side, I'm going to need to carry the dark yarn from the row previous. And this is so that when I turn and I'm ready for the dark working on the other side, it's there for me. This results in a more dense fabric. So I recommend this if you're making something that's going to be dense and non-stretchy, such as coasters, or cup cozies, or different things like that, because you don't really want a lot of stretch in those projects. So as I'm bringing this up, I'm going to lay both the yarns over so that I can carry them as I go. So I'm working the white. I'm going to work my plaid stitch like I normally would. I started with a chain. I'm going to work in the last 3 stitches of the previous row, which are now the first 3 stitches. And then the dark gray is simply just going to go along for the ride. It's going to be carried the whole time. And you're going to be carrying 2 yarns this time, alternating between your light and your mid. Make sure that you're remembering to just very, very gently tug it so that your stitches are close together, but not so tight that you lose any drape to the fabric. It's especially important to make sure that you're tugging those yarns, because if you're working a turning fabric, it means that there's no right or wrong side. So when you are when you're tugging those ends, you want to make sure you're doing that so that there's no little bits of yarn poking through right there. You want to have the carried yarns to be almost invisible. You can see here that I have not been using my own technique. It takes a little bit of practice and a little bit of concentration to make sure you're pulling the yarns to the right edge that they need to be on. I'm going to gently tug so you can kind of see the stitches are a little bit far apart. They're just very gently tug so they kind of pull a little closer together. Okay, so we finished our second row. And now that we can see that we carried this dark yarn and it's right here for us because we're going to need it on this side. So I'm going to finish this stitch and then switch back to my dark. I'm going to pull a loop through and then pull the bottom color and the loop disappears. And then you're ready to continue the pattern. An alternative to this is to work a block that takes up 2 rows, and that way you do not need to carry it, and when you're doing that you end up with a much more stretchy fabric. If you're wanting a stretchier fabric, I recommend doing a larger block, one that is either 2 to 4 or even bigger, but it needs to be an even number, and that way you don't need to carry the third yarn that you're not using. So for instance, just taking it up to a 4x2 would make it so you wouldn't need to carry the color that you're not using. So to do this, you would simply work a 4 double crochet for each block, and then you would repeat the same colors for the second row. So when you finish that row, you're going to turn and you're going to work the exact same colorway on the second row. To pull up that color, you want to make sure that you're pulling it up right as you're turning so that you have it when you need it. So you're going to immediately begin carrying it, so pull it up and make sure that you work it within the first stitch. And you might need to pull that tight a little bit. You can see that it's very loose in there. Pull it tight so that it's not creating a bothersome loop on the outside. When you're working a project with turning plaid rows, you will need to plan on creating an edge down the side, because when you're pulling up the yarns, it does create a little bit of an edge, an undesirable edge. Okay, so once you're finished with that second row, then we're going to switch. So you can finish that last stitch. And then you're going to pull through a loop and then pull down the gray until the loop disappears. So then you can let this part hang because you're doing 2 rows and it will be right where you need it when you come back. So I recommend this method if you're creating something that needs a little more stretch, a little better drape. So you're going to bring up that gray and make sure that you begin carrying it immediately so that you can have it Okay, so we're going to switch to gray because the grays are always diagonal. The mid is always diagonal. So you're going to pull that up, pull a loop through, and tighten it so that the one loop is the visible loop. So then I'm going to work my first square, the first bottom half of the square. And I'm going to work this before I join the light yarn just for easier weaving it of ends later. You can weave it in a block that's the same color. So then I'm going to join this light. And then I'm going to repeat what I did with the first 2 rows. You're going to work the 4, which is the bottom half of the square, and then the next row over, the next row on top, you're going to work the same color and the same stitches, creating the top half of the square of the block. And this method I like better because you still preserve the stretchiness of the fabric because you're not having to carry 2 yarns. And it makes it look just a little bit nicer. So if you can make your project so that the squares are a little bit bigger, then I recommend this way of using 2 rows or 4 or 6, depending on how big you want to go. And then you don't have to carry that second yarn. So we're starting the second row, and I just wanted to remind you again that you want to carry that gray. So we're starting our second row, and I wanted to remind you again to make sure that you're carrying that gray immediately so that you have it right when you need it. You want to pull that tight so that you don't have any scraggly loops hanging out, because that would be harder to take care of later when you're working your edge. So to complete the blocks, you're going to work back over them using the same exact colors. So that is another method for working the plaid stitch and turning rows. So use your creativity. You can mix up the colors, you can mix up the size of the squares, but just keep in mind if the size is an odd number, so 1, 3, 5, you're going to have to carry both yarns, and if it's even, 2, 4, 6, 8, you can drop the color and you don't need to carry it. In our next lesson, we're going to be learning how to work increases while keeping the plaid stitch pattern.